Hey everyone, it is Reverend Dr. Katie. I hope you're doing really well. I am going to talk tonight for a few minutes about a question that's been coming up and got a lot of good discussion. And that question is about original sin. So let's not waste any time. Let's just dive right in. And this is a doctrine and a concept that is certainly very prevalent in popular culture. Like, oh my gosh, every Fruit of the Loom commercial will somehow reference like a red apple and kind of show pictures of Adam and Eve in their underwear, right? I've seen this over and over and over played out again in so many different ways in our popular culture, and it's part of our popular culture. It's also, for many people, part of their church culture. And so I'm going to give you the rundown of like how original sin is usually interpreted, and then also give us some options for seeing this biblical story of Genesis 2 and 3 in some new ways. So hang with me for a few minutes and let's go through this. So I'm going to give you the really quick, dirty version of how we have come to the concept of original sin. So this is rooted in the biblical story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3. And really broadly, the doctrine says that Adam and Eve committed like the first sin, and then they were punished by being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and then humanity then is born with this original sin. And that varies widely according to your church tradition. Different church traditions either dispute this or reject it or accept it with different caveats. You should all know sort of the Catholic Church gets unfairly characterized sometimes with the doctrine of original sin, and although that is a doctrine in Catholicism, the Catholic Church sees the story of Adam and Eve as metaphorical. So that is something that you should know right off the bat. You can do more reading about that on your own. So I want you to know that a couple of things. Jews do not interpret the story of Adam and Eve as having anything to do with sin at all. So, in fact, the culture from which this story originates does not see the story as one about sin. Christians have started interpreting this story as one having to do with something about sin in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but actually not in the 1st century and not in the first half of the 2nd century. So with early Christians that we call church fathers like Irenaeus and Augustine, they are the ones who developed this idea, or Irenaeus began to develop it and articulate it, and Augustine is the one who ran with it. So for nearly 2 or 3 centuries, actually, Christians didn't see the story necessarily as a story about sin. And so just a few reflection. I don't think it's any secret that we're born into a world where there are a lot of problems. We're born into a world with violence. We're born into a world where people don't have equal rights. We're born into a world of inequity and exploitation. We're born into a world where we are called to do God's work. Now, whether or not we want to call that original sin or something else or whatever the causes are, I think that's something as Christians that we have to acknowledge, right? We need to do something about this world that we happen to be living in that in fact is sinful. And I don't mean that in the classic like finger shaking kind of way. I mean it in a world that has vast inequities. We're called to do something about that, right? Why that's the case is really what's at question here, though, right? So let's go through this a little bit. I want to go through the Bible story because, y'all, this is like my scholar's heart. This makes me really happy to be able to go through the Bible in this way. So let's back up and look at the Bible story that talks from where we get the concept of original sin and see if there's anything there or not for you. Now, everyone's going to have a different point of view, and that's great. We all should. Not totalitarian about this. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to put aside just briefly your personal history with the story of the man and the woman in the garden. Gently set that to the side for now, and instead enter this story as if you're seeing it for the very first time and hearing it for the very first time. And as much as you can, put aside your anxiety about this story, and let's have it come alive with new meaning for us. So the basic story is this. There is a human being in the garden. This human being is often called Adam, but is unnamed for most of the story. So just a human being. And the human being has dominion over all of creation. And when this human being becomes lonely, God takes a part of this human being and creates another human being from it. and then they become two human beings, and it's only there that we kind of get some gender differentiation between these two human beings, and they become a man and a woman. And eventually the man and the woman listen to one particular animal in the garden, which is the serpent. And they say that they only have one rule, which is not to eat of a particular tree. And in talking to the serpent, they in fact do eat from this tree. And when they eat from the tree, they become aware. They become aware, for instance, that they don't have on clothing. They become aware of their own bodies. And when God comes back down into the garden, they say they don't come out to meet God because they are naked. And God asks a very human question: who told you that? Right? So we have, in this kind of retelling of the story, I want to point out a few things. God is very human-like in this story. God responds almost like a human when God says, who told you you're naked? Who told you you don't have clothes, right? Is that something that God's asking as a genuine question? Maybe because God doesn't know that in this particular telling of the story. Or is God asking that as a rhetorical question? Most of you are going to say, no, that's a rhetorical question. God knew. Play with me just for a minute. And maybe God didn't know the answer to that question, and God asked that as a very human question. I'm going to return to that particular point in just a minute. I want to point out something else. We often call the eating of the fruit as the first sin. The word sin is never mentioned, never, not once in Genesis 2 and 3. Go back and read it for yourself. The word is not there. So what I want to point out to you is that interpreting this story as sin, you may or you may not. Interpreting the story as sin is in fact an interpretation. It's not part of the story. We often say that the serpent character is Satan. It never says that, right? So again, that's an interpretation. You may believe that, you may not. What I want you to realize is that that's something we put on the story, not something that's in the story itself. Okay, so hopefully this information is new to you. This is like breaking open new ways to understand this story. I don't want to give away the whole farm because this is something we can do like in a Bible study later on. So I'm going to give you just a little bit more about this story though. And this comes from a scholar named Marcus Borg. He's not the only one who has said this. Other people have, but Marcus Borg says it very, very nicely. And Borg died 2 or 3 years ago actually. So rest in peace because I do love his work. And so Marcus Borg actually gives the idea that maybe this story is a metaphor about the birth of humanity, about humans growing up. Because it's when we start to grow up that we realize, for instance, that we have bodies and that we may be embarrassed by being without clothes and that we need to make clothes, right? So that's kind of a story about the transition that every human being has from the time they're a baby or a toddler or a small kid into older childhood and definitely into adolescence and adulthood. And it's a story about waking up, becoming aware of ourselves, becoming aware of our circumstances. So what if the story of Adam and Eve, who again are not given names until after this awareness that they have. So what if this is a story about humanity waking up and coming into full relationship with themselves and with the divine, right? Because they see that their relationship with the divine begins to change and morph after their awareness. All of us have relationships with God that change and grow and morph as we become adults, as we enter into full spiritual maturity throughout our lives. So if this is a story about original sin, to me, I'm going to back up. If this is a story about original sin, to me, this is not some kind of cloak that every human is born with or wears. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that we are born into a world with a lot of problems, right? And when, like the man and the woman, we become aware of these problems and our role in the world, we can then develop consciousness to do something about it. So it's after this that Adam and Eve actually get to do cool stuff, like farm and have agriculture, have children, grow up, get old, right? Until this point in time, they're not aware enough to even be able to do any of those things. Are you hanging with me so far? Okay, so I'm gonna assume that you all are. So I want to compare this story to the one that comes right before it. So this is one creation story we have in the Bible, and there's a story that comes right before it, which is the creation of the universe in 7 days. And I bet you're very familiar with this one, again, just from popular culture, where God says, let there be light, and there was light, and that was day 1, right? And we go through the 7 days of creation. What I want to point out to you is that Adam and Eve do not show up in the 7 days of creation. We have that creation story, this beautiful cosmic story of a cosmic God who creates the universe in 7 days. And then next to it, we have the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. 2 different stories side by side, beautifully complementing one another, but not telling the same story. So if we can see those 2 stories as juxtaposed and next to each other and telling beautiful but different stories of creation, we can begin to see the beauty and the depth that's available to us in Scripture. And the way that Scripture is this kind of response to God's presence in the lives of humans, but told through a very, very human lens much of the time, and then later interpreted through very human lens. And so if we can develop that capacity to hold Scripture tenderly as one way to see some but not all of God, we can begin to develop that relationship in really profound and meaningful ways. And I know many of you have been really, really hurt with the Bible. The Bible has been used as a weapon in your life. The Bible has been used to shame. The Bible has been used to shame you, not to lift you up, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. So I want to encourage you not to give up on the Bible, but to change your relationship with Scripture. And when we do that, we have the ability to critique and to fall in love and to hold and to say at times, you know, these people sometimes just didn't get this right, and we now have other ways of understanding who God is. And all of those can be held at once in a beautiful place together. And that's what I wish and hope for all of you. So let me tell you some things that are coming up and why this is important for metaphysical Christians. And even before I do that, let me return to that point that I made earlier, that God seems very human in this story, right? God is asking things like, how do you know you don't have on clothes? Maybe God is asking that because this is the portrait of a particular people that lived 1,000 years BC, 1000 BC, and the way that they understood God. They understood God as someone who's very human. The writer of Genesis 1 understood God as someone who is cosmic and rules the entire universe. We don't actually see that present in Genesis 2 and 3. So 2 distinct stories with different but gorgeous representations of the divine. And maybe all of those can be true all at once. So let me tell you 2 things coming down the pipeline. So one is we are having a Bible study for metaphysical Christians in August. So that is going to start a month from now on, I don't know if it's on August 1st, but in the first week of August. And this is going to be a Bible study that's called a contextual Bible study. And it is specifically for those of you who are Christian and see yourself as a metaphysical person, but maybe you struggle with the Bible or you struggle where to see your place in the Bible. So we're going to have that Bible study, and that's going to inform actually a scholarly paper that I'm writing. So this is awesome because you guys will be like part of scholarship, and I'm really excited about that. So I'm going to getting details to you about that soon. But the second thing that's going to come a little later is an opportunity for those of you who need radical healing in your relationship with the Bible. Like if someone mentions the Bible to you and you feel yourself like hackles getting raised and people quote Scripture at you and you don't know what to do, but you know that there is something in there for you and you don't know what it is, that's the Bible study that's going to be for you. So if there's 2 things coming up, I would love to have you all participate in one or both of them. So I'll be getting you more information. I just want you to know why that's important. And as a metaphysical Christian, you are going to be challenged on the way you engage with the metaphysical world, from the world outside from time to time. You need to know your Scripture and your interpretation of Scripture enough to be able to converse, not fight, but to converse with people and to explain your point of view. So if you constantly find yourself right now saying, oh, I don't know, yeah, gosh, Leviticus does say that, and so I'm a little confused here, but you know deep down what's going on inside of you. This will be the Bible study for you, that second one that I mentioned, so you can come into whole relationship and know what to tell people in a way that's authentic for you. And again, we're not into fighting with people, we're into conversing with people. So as a metaphysical Christian, you need to have sort of all of the above, and you need to have your facts down. And this is where I can come in really handy, because I've been studying this forever, right? So I will actually be able to give you like Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic terms and backgrounds of the books of the Bible and ways that the Bible has been interpreted over the years. There's not just one way, there's lots of different ways, and help you facilitate that relationship with Scripture. Because I have news for you. This is not news, but I have something to tell you. Scripture and the Bible are not going anywhere. They're here to stay. And so I want us all to get really comfortable with engaging with Scripture at a bunch of different levels. Other people are going to do it to you, so you might as well get comfortable with this so that you can engage and be part of that conversation and be part of the healing force in the world, because the Bible is used as a weapon. So I want you to be someone who can use that as a force of love and loving kindness, and use it responsibly, because we see it not used responsibly all the time. So this is one of my big missions in life. I think you can tell I'm really passionate about it. I've dedicated many years of study to being able to do this. I've written a book about it. I have other things coming out, right? I have these scholarly articles, all that kind of stuff. I'm not suggesting you need to read all of that. I'm just telling you why I am so passionate about this, and passionate enough to have dedicated, a decade of my life to studying this professionally. And I want you to be able to benefit from that. That should not stay like with scholars. It should be with everyone. Okay, so original sin, we got into the Bible story a little bit. You and your particular Christian tradition will be the deciders of how you interpret original sin. What I want you to see is that there's more than one option, and those options are pretty good. I love the option of this story not being about sin so much, but about humans becoming aware. And when we become aware, we see that we do live in a world that is filled with the exploitation and corruption. And I do believe that that is sinful. And I think that we're forces that are fighting against that and doing the work that Christ has called us to do. I'm one of those people. You're one of those people. As one of those people, I want you to be as fully equipped in that mission as you possibly can. That's what I'm here for. If you want to be on the mailing list for either one of those, let me know. You can private message me. You can write your name underneath with your email, and I'll put you on the sign-up list so you will get a first word about it. All right? Love you all. Hope you're doing really well, and I will talk to you soon.